For decades, the Republican Party has desperately tried to persuade the American people that they are the pro-life party, when in fact the evidence shows that they're merely the pro-forced birth party, and there's a meaningful difference. And if there are any doubts whatsoever, look no further than the evil that Ken Paxton, the corrupt Republican Attorney General of Texas, is deliberately trying to inflict on one of his own constituents. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, I have several clips to play, but be warned, this is a very traumatic story. It's a story of trauma on the part of Kate Cox, the constituent in question, and evil on the part of Ken Paxton, the Republican elected official in question.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is warning a doctor who was authorized by a judge to perform an abortion that she could still face penalties for that. The legal threat coming after the judge ruled in favor of a pregnant woman today who had sued the state to allow her doctor to perform that abortion despite the state's strict ban that has very few and narrow exceptions. This is believed to be one of the first attempts in the U.S. where someone is trying to get a court-ordered abortion after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. In her lawsuit, Kate Cox, who is 20 weeks pregnant, said her unborn baby had been diagnosed with trisomy 18. It's a genetic abnormality that almost always has a fatality before birth or soon after. Her doctor told her that her condition would not only put her life at risk, but also threaten her ability to be able to have children in the future.
Pretty harrowing stuff. A stark contradiction to the straw man that's usually peddled by the Republican Party and alleged pro-lifers, which is that people who try to avail themselves of the right to an abortion, they're evil. They deliberately get pregnant or they negligently get pregnant, and then they drag it out as long as possible to try to abort a healthy fetus. That's not the case. That's really never the case, and certainly not the case here. If you have any doubts about that, listen to Kate Cox's own words.
It's a hard time, even with, being hopeful with the decision that came from the hearing this morning. There's still, we're going through the loss of a child. There's no outcome here that I take home my healthy baby girl, so it's hard,
So again, this is a person who's already a mother of two. She wanted to get pregnant. She wanted to carry this third fetus to term, have a third baby, and potentially even more, okay? But the doctor diagnosed it with a high probability of death. This is a non-viable fetus, and the longer it stays in her, the risk to her own health and her potential future for other kids are greater. This is the worst case scenario. This should be, even I think, for any sane alleged pro-lifer, this should be the most textbook case of an acceptable abortion, even by the strictest pro-life standards. And yet, Ken Paxton is threatening to prosecute the doctor. And we have some clips here which go into even more detail about what exactly Ken Paxton may do to not only the doctor, but even other people in Kate Cox's life who try to help her get an abortion that was allowed by the judge.
The judge adding, the longer Ms. Cox stays pregnant, the greater risks to her life.
It's unclear if the state will try to fight this ruling, but tonight, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is threatening to go after any doctor who might try to perform Kate Cox's abortion, saying they could still face serious penalties, including the loss of their license and up to life in prison. Even her own husband could be at risk on charges of aiding and abetting an abortion.
Threaten any physician who may perform the abortion. The court-ordered, judge-approved, judge-sanctioned abortion for a non-viable fetus, which is threatening the life of the mother, and even her husband for potentially aiding and abetting. Now, Caitlin Collins of CNN also talked to Kate Cox's attorney about, this bullying, this evil coming from Ken Paxton, and this is what the attorney had to say.
Mark, I wonder what you make of the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who came out tonight and was saying that the hospitals, the doctors, that they're not insulated from civil and criminal liability for violating that law, despite what the judge said today, that this procedure can go forward.
Caitlin, this is shameful. The Attorney General of the state of Texas is telling everyone that a judge's order, that a judge's injunction is essentially meaningless, and that he's going to come after doctors and hospitals, and that they're exposing themselves to criminal liability, to the threat of lawsuits, to loss of professional licenses if they're following a judge's order. We have a legal system in this country. We have rules. We have a rule of law. This is a democracy.
But Republicans don't care about that. And now you see like the prism of why this is terrible. There's the moral issue. This is the fact that he is, inflicting great cruelty on one of his own constituents, Kate Cox. But there's also the complete defiance of allegedly conservative principles of separation of powers and small government. Ken Paxton, this Republican Attorney General, is saying, yeah, the courts don't matter. The courts matter when I say they matter, when I agree with a judge's decision. But if a judge finds that this meets an exception to the state's abortion law, I'm just going to disregard that out of, perhaps religious reasons, religious convictions, or perhaps misogyny, perhaps that too, or perhaps a combination thereof. Now, as a reminder of who Ken Paxton is, he's probably the most corrupt Republican Attorney General in the United States and one of the most corrupt Republican elected officials as well. So he was actually impeached by his own party. Republicans in Texas impeached this man. 16 articles of impeachment alleging corruption and bribery. However, as was the case with Donald Trump in the federal level, Republicans in the Texas Senate didn't have the courage to follow through, so he was acquitted. Now, at the same time, he's actually facing criminal prosecution potentially on securities fraud, okay? So these charges were made 8 years ago. It's been a long delayed situation. But that's how corrupt Ken Paxton is. And I'll simply say this. The moniker of pro-life does not belong to the Republican Party, much the same way that the moniker of the party of personal accountability, personal responsibility, the party of law and order, none of these titles, appellations, belong to the current iteration of the Republican Party, if they ever belonged to them in the first place. The Republican Party, in terms of its elected officials, in terms of what they value, they're not pro-life. Because if they are pro-life, that means to them life ends at the womb. All they care about is forcing women to gestate fetuses against their will. As soon as that fetus leaves the birth canal, Republican elected officials do not and have never cared about what happens. Otherwise, they would, support pre- and neonatal care. They would, want to strengthen and bolster social safety nets. They would want to expand, for example, and maintain the child tax credit, which cut child poverty in half, but they, at the federal level, all 50 Republicans in the United States Senate, deliberately allowed it to expire. They are not the pro-life party. They're the pro-forced birth party. And as we head into 2024, both at the federal and the state level, everybody needs to be thinking about this. You cannot trust Republican elected officials not to do things like Ken Paxton. They may say they're pro-life, but the record shows that as a general principle, all they care is about controlling the bodies and wombs of females in this country. That's all they care about. And you can't trust them to do or say anything opposite, because otherwise, every Republican who was genuinely pro-life would be saying, Ken Paxton, this is gross, this is disgusting, how dare you? But they're not doing that because they don't care, which is why everywhere you can in 2024, the state, local, and federal level, you should vote blue no matter who. The Republican Party is not introspective. They have no interest in compromising or moderating in terms of their views on abortion. They don't care that in Ohio and in Kansas and in Kentucky, deeply red states, that they lose again and again and again and again and again on the subject of abortion. They just will try to rewrite the rules or entrench their institutional advantage, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago in Ohio. That's what they do. They don't care about reflecting the views of the majority or acting in ways that aren't deliberately cruel. The cruelty is the point. So with that in mind, vote blue every chance you get and send them a message. Let me know what you think in the comments.